Welcome back to Sleep Theories. Get comfortable. Let the room go quiet. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears, and let the day you just finished start to loosen its grip on you, one small piece at a time. Tonight's story comes to us from a listener named Darren, who wrote in and suggested this topic. If you have a topic you want to hear, make sure to drop a comment down below, also mentioning where in the world you're listening from and what time it is, as we love seeing how far this community reaches. Now let's begin. Imagine for a moment that you're standing at the very end of New York. Not the city, the state. The actual end of it. The last handful of miles of sand and scrub oak and wind-blown pine before the continent gives up and surrenders to open ocean. This is Montauk, and it feels like the edge of something. People who visit always say the same thing. They say it feels like the end of the world out here. They say the light is different. They say the wind comes off the water carrying salt and cold even in the middle of summer, and that on certain evenings, when the fog rolls in low across the bluffs, you can stand on the cliffs and lose all sense of where you are. Behind you, the whole country. Ahead of you, 3,000 miles of grey water, and to your left, hidden in a stand of scrub pine, rising above the trees like something that does not belong to this century, there is a tower. You would notice it immediately. Everyone does. It is a squat concrete building, 4 stories tall, and mounted on top of it is an enormous rectangular dish, easily 80 feet across, curved like a giant metal sail. It does not look like art. It does not look like architecture. It looks like a machine that was built to listen to something very far away, and it looks like it is still listening. The locals call it the radar tower. The military called it something less poetic. It was a radar designated ANF-PS-35, and in its working life it was one of the most powerful search radars on the eastern seaboard of the United States. It could see aircraft more than 200 miles out over the Atlantic. It turned slowly, constantly, sweeping the sky for Soviet bombers that everyone expected and nobody wanted throughout the coldest decades of the Cold War. That tower is real. You can drive to it. You can park and walk a marked trail and stand underneath it in the middle of the afternoon with a coffee in your hand while children run past you on the path. It sits inside Camp Hero State Park, and it is listed on the National Register of Historic Places, and it is one of the last radars of its kind still standing anywhere in the country. That is where our story takes place. And to understand why anyone ever believed the things they believed about this place, you first have to understand how strange the real history already was. Let me tell you about Camp Hero as it actually existed. The land was purchased by the United States Army in the 1920s and 1930s, in the long uneasy stretch between 2 world wars, and it was named for Major General Andrew Hero Jr., who had served as the Army's Chief of Coast Artillery. That was the point of the place. Coastal artillery. Montauk sits at the mouth of Long Island Sound, and whoever controls that point controls the approach to New York Harbor. If an enemy fleet ever came for the greatest port city in America, this scrubby, wind-swept headland is where they would have to pass. So the Army fortified it. And here is the first strange thing, the first genuinely strange thing, and it is entirely documented. They disguised it. The fortifications at Camp Hero were built during the Second World War to look, from the ocean, like a sleepy New England fishing village. The gun batteries were concealed under structures made to resemble ordinary buildings. Concrete bunkers were given fake pitched roofs. Fake windows and fake doors and fake shutters were painted directly onto reinforced concrete walls, complete with painted curtains, so that a submarine commander looking through a periscope from a few miles offshore would see nothing but a quiet little town going about its business. Think about that for a moment as you lie there in the dark. There were buildings at Montauk whose windows were not windows, whose doors did not open, whose entire purpose was to make an observer believe that nothing important was happening there. That is not a conspiracy theory. That is the architectural record. It is in the historical surveys. It is the actual documented design intent of the United States Army Corps of Engineers, and some of those painted details survived for decades, slowly fading in the salt air. So the very first thing Camp Hero ever learned how to do, professionally, at enormous expense, was to look like something it was not. Hold on to that thought. It will matter later. Beneath those disguised buildings, the army installed 16-inch guns, artillery pieces so large that a single shell weighed more than a small car, capable of throwing that shell out over the horizon to targets more than 20 miles away. Underground magazines were dug to store the ammunition. Tunnels connected the batteries to the plotting rooms. Concrete corridors ran under the sand. And then the war ended, and the guns were never fired at an enemy. Not once. The German fleet never came. The great coastal defence system of the eastern United States turned out to be a spectacular and expensive answer to a question nobody ended up asking. The guns were removed in the late 1940s, the army left, and Camp Hero, for a brief moment, went quiet. But not for long, because a new war had already begun, and this one was colder, and it came from a different direction. It came from above. In 1951, the Air Force took over the site, and Montauk was reborn as a radar station. Over the following years, a series of increasingly powerful radar systems were installed there, culminating in the enormous ANF PS-35 that still stands today, erected in the late 1950s. It became part of the great electronic curtain that the United States drew across its own northern and eastern approaches, a chain of unblinking eyes staring outward, waiting for the shape of something inbound. The men and women stationed there worked shifts around the clock in windowless rooms, watching phosphor screens, chasing returns, logging contacts, most of which were weather, or flocks of birds, or civilian airliners on their way to somewhere ordinary. The radar turned, the tower hummed, the wind came off the Atlantic, and here is the second genuinely strange thing about Camp Hero, and again, it is entirely documented. The radar was enormously powerful, and it was pointed at the edge of a town. People who lived in Montauk during those years reported interference. They reported that certain appliances behaved oddly. There are stories, some of them well attested, of people who claimed they could hear the radar or feel it, or that it caused strange effects in the immediate area. Whether every one of these accounts is accurate is genuinely debatable, but the underlying physics is not mysterious at all. A radar of that class radiates a very great deal of energy into the environment, in pulses, on a fixed and predictable rhythm. It swept, and swept, and swept. Something enormous and invisible passing through the town, over and over every few seconds for 30 years. You cannot see it, you cannot smell it, but it is there, and it is passing through you, and it has been passing through you your entire life, if you happen to live in that particular corner of Long Island. Now hold those two documented facts together in your mind. A military base built specifically to look like something it was not, and an invisible force radiating out of it, day and night, for decades, that the human body cannot perceive but that unquestionably passes through everything in its path. Do you see it? Do you see how the ground was prepared? Because in 1981, the Air Force shut the station down, the radar stopped turning, the personnel left, and Camp Hero was abandoned, standing empty at the end of Long Island, with its fake windows and its sealed bunkers and its enormous silent dish, surrounded by chain-link fence and warning signs, slowly being reclaimed by the scrub pine, an abandoned military installation, closed to the public, full of underground structures nobody would explain, sitting at the end of a road, at the end of an island, at the end of the world. If you wanted to design a place for a legend to grow, you could not do better than that, and a legend grew. But that is the real history. That is the part you can verify. Now let me tell you the story. Now let me tell you about a man who never existed, and the summer he took a job he did not understand. In the spring of 1970, a 28-year-old electronics engineer named Nathaniel Rourke drove east out of New York City with everything he owned packed into the back of a second-hand station wagon. He had a degree in electrical engineering, a decent record with a defense contractor in New Jersey, and a very specific talent that had made him quietly valuable. Rourke was good at power, not politics, actual power, current and load and distribution. He could look at a facility's electrical infrastructure and tell you, within a few percent, what the building was doing, simply by understanding what it was consuming. Machines have appetites, and Rourke could read them the way a doctor reads a pulse. He had been offered a contract position at a radar installation on the far end of Long Island. The work was described to him as unglamorous. Modifications to an aging search radar, efficiency studies, maintenance of the power distribution system. The pay was substantially better than the work seemed to justify, and he noticed that, and he decided not to think about it too hard, because he was 28 years old and the rent was due and the pay was better. He drove east for 3 hours. The highway narrowed. The suburbs gave way to potato fields, and the potato fields gave way to scrub, and the scrub gave way to that strange, thin, wind-swept country, where the whole island seems to be holding its breath before it ends. And then he came round a curve and he saw the tower for the first time. He would remember that moment for the rest of his life. He wrote about it later, in a notebook that would eventually matter a great deal. He said the dish was turning as he came over the rise, slow and enormous, and the low sun was behind it, and for one long second the tower looked less like a machine, and more like something that had noticed him arriving. Rourke's first month at Camp Hero was almost disappointingly normal. He was assigned a small office in a low concrete building with a leaking roof. He met the radar technicians, most of whom were career Air Force, and treated contractors with the polite indifference of men who have watched 100 consultants come and go. He walked the site. He inventoried the power distribution. He learned where the transformers were and where the feeds ran, and which sections of the base still drew current and which had been dead since the 1950s. The work was ordinary. The base was ordinary. The food in the mess hall was ordinary in a way that bordered on aggressive. And then, 5 weeks in, Rourke ran the numbers. It was routine. It was in fact the exact thing he had been hired to do. He compiled the total electrical consumption of Camp Hero and compared it against what the installed equipment should have been drawing, and the numbers were wrong. Not slightly wrong. Not the kind of wrong that comes from an old building with bad insulation and a boiler that runs too long. Camp Hero was consuming, by Rourke's calculation, somewhere between 3 and 4 times the electricity that its documented equipment could possibly account for, even accounting for the enormous draw of the radar itself, even accounting for every heater, every light, every kitchen, every pump. There was a hole in the ledger the size of a small factory. Rourke did what any competent engineer would do. He assumed he had made an error. He ran it again. He got the same answer. He walked the entire distribution system by hand, following cable runs, opening panels, tracing feeds, and he found something that made his stomach go cold in a way he could not immediately explain. There was a feed leaving the main substation that did not appear on any drawing he had been given. It was heavy, it was buried, and it ran, as far as he could determine, downward. Now. Understand something about Nathaniel Rourke. He was not a paranoid man. He was not a man who went looking for conspiracies. He was a practical, slightly boring, deeply competent engineer who liked his problems to close cleanly. And so his first instinct was not fear. His first instinct was irritation. Somebody had given him incomplete drawings and expected him to do a power study. That was sloppy, and sloppiness annoyed him. So he asked. He walked into the office of the site supervisor, a tired man named Halloran with reading glasses and a permanent squint, and he laid out the numbers, and he said politely that there appeared to be a substantial load on the system. It was not documented anywhere, and could he please have the complete drawings? Halloran looked at the numbers for a long moment. Then he said, without any particular emotion, that the drawings Rourke had were the drawings that existed, and that the discrepancy was almost certainly a metering error, and that Rourke should focus on the radar modifications, which were what he had been hired for. And Rourke, who was young and needed the money, said all right. But he did not stop noticing. Because once you notice one thing that does not fit, you begin to notice others. That is simply how the mind works. It is why loose threads are dangerous. You pull one, and suddenly you can see all of them. The first thing he noticed was the trucks. They came at night. Not every night. 2 or 3 times a month, always well after midnight, always the same kind of vehicle, a plain box truck with no markings, and they did not stop at the loading area behind the mess hall where every other delivery in the history of Camp Hero had been unloaded. They drove past it. They went to a building near the northern edge of the site, a squat windowless structure that Rourke's drawings labelled as a storage facility, and they backed up to a roll door, and men who were not Air Force personnel unloaded them, and then they left before dawn. Rourke, being an engineer, made a note of the dates. Not because he suspected anything specific, because making notes was what he did. The second thing he noticed was the elevators. There should not have been elevators. That was the whole problem. Camp Hero's buildings were, with a very small number of exceptions, 1 or 2 stories tall. There was no reason on earth for a passenger elevator in a 2-story concrete block building. And yet, in the northern building, the one the trucks visited, Rourke saw people go inside in the morning and he saw people come out in the evening, and he never once saw them on the upper floor because there was no upper floor. They were going down. He knew they were going down. He knew it because he was an engineer and he understood buildings, and he knew it because of the third thing, which was the ventilation. You cannot hide breathing. That is the thing that people always forget. You can bury a facility, you can seal it, you can leave it off every drawing in the building, but if there are human beings inside it, then that facility has to breathe. And breathing requires an exchange of air with the surface, and that exchange has to happen somewhere. Rourke started walking the base in the early mornings before his shift, with a cup of coffee in his hand, looking like a man taking the air, and he found the vents. They were disguised, of course. Camp Hero had been disguising things since the 1940s, and it was very good at it. Some of them looked like drainage structures. One of them was inside what appeared to be an ordinary utility shed, but they were warm. On a cold morning in April, with frost still on the scrub grass, Rourke stood beside a concrete structure that was supposed to be a storm drain, and felt warm air rising out of it, and he could smell it, and it did not smell like a storm drain. It smelled like an occupied building, like machinery and floor wax and coffee. There were people down there, a great many people, judging by the volume of air moving, and nobody had told him. But the thing that broke Nathaniel Rourke open, the thing that turned a curious man into an obsessed one, happened on a Wednesday in June. He had stayed late. There was a problem with the transformer, and he had spent the evening tracing a fault, and by the time he finished it was well past 1 in the morning, and he was too tired to face the drive to the rented room in town where he was staying, so he decided to sleep on the cot in his office. At 2 o'clock in the morning, exactly 2 o'clock, the radar changed. Rourke sat up in the dark. Understand. He had been living inside the sound of that radar for 3 months. It had become the background of his life. The great dish turned at a fixed rate, and the drive machinery made a specific low sound at a specific rhythm, and the power draw pulsed in a pattern that Rourke could have drawn on graph paper from memory. It was as familiar to him as his own heartbeat. And at 2 o'clock in the morning the rhythm broke. The dish stopped turning, he could hear it stop, and then the pitch of everything changed, dropping, deepening, as the system began drawing power in a way it never drew power during ordinary operations. The lights in his office dimmed, held, and came back. The fluorescent tube above his desk buzzed, and then went silent in a way that fluorescent tubes should not. And Rourke felt something. He described it later in that notebook, and he struggled with the description, because he was a precise man, and he did not have precise language for it. He said it was like the feeling in your teeth when someone drags metal across a plate. He said it was like standing too close to something falling. He said his eyes watered, and the hair on his forearms lifted, and he had, for perhaps 4 seconds, the absolutely certain conviction that there was someone standing behind him in a room he knew was empty. Then it stopped. The dish began turning again. The lights came back up. The fluorescent tube resumed its buzzing. Rourke sat on the edge of the cot in the dark for a very long time. The next morning he checked the operational logs for the radar, which he had access to because power studies required them. There was no entry for 2 o'clock. There was no entry for anything unusual at all. According to the logs, the radar had rotated continuously all night at standard parameters, so he waited a week. And on the following Wednesday, at 2 o'clock in the morning, from a position he had chosen carefully behind a stand of pine 400 yards away, Nathaniel Rourke watched the great dish stop turning. He watched it stop with its face pointed not out to sea and not at the sky, but tilted down, angled toward the ground, toward the base itself, toward whatever was underneath it. And Rourke understood, standing there in the cold with the ocean roaring somewhere below the bluffs, that he had been hired to study a radar that was not looking for aircraft. He had been hired to study a machine that was pointing at the earth and pushing. It took another 4 months for Camp Hero to come and get him. That is the part of the story that nobody ever expects. People imagine that if you go poking at a secret, the secret responds by throwing you out. Sometimes it does. But sometimes, if the secret has a use for you, it does something far more dangerous. It invites you in. In October of 1973, Nathaniel Rourke was called into Halloran's office and told, without preamble, that he was being considered for expanded access, and that this would involve a background investigation, and that if he had anything in his history he would prefer not to discuss, now was the moment to mention it. Rourke said he did not. He was telling the truth. He had a speeding ticket, an ex-fiancée in Trenton, and a library card. 6 weeks later he signed a stack of documents whose language he only half understood, and a man he had never seen before walked him to the northern building, the one with the trucks, and used a key on an unmarked door, and Rourke stepped into an elevator that did not officially exist. He counted on the way down. That was his instinct. He counted seconds and he estimated speed, and by the time the doors opened he calculated that he was somewhere between 100 and 140 feet below the surface of Long Island. The doors opened onto a corridor with white walls and a polished floor and fluorescent lighting, and it looked, Rourke wrote, exactly like the 3rd floor of a mid-sized hospital. That was the part he could never get over. Not the depth, not the secrecy, the banality. He had spent months imagining something out of a film, and instead he found linoleum and bulletin boards and a coffee machine that took nickels. The facility was designated Phoenix 3. Rourke asked on his first day what had happened to Phoenix 1 and Phoenix 2. Nobody answered him, not rudely. They simply moved on to the next subject the way you might if a guest asked about a family member who had died badly. The stated purpose of Phoenix 3 was, on paper, entirely respectable. And this is the thing you have to understand if you want to understand how good people end up in bad rooms. The project's official research mandate was the study of the neurological and psychological effects of electromagnetic radiation on human subjects. That is a real field. That was a real Cold War preoccupation. Both superpowers spent the middle of the 20th century deeply concerned about what could be done to the human mind with energy, with drugs, with isolation, with suggestion. That concern was not imaginary. There is a documented American history of research programs into behavioral modification, and there is documented history of interest in remote viewing and unconventional intelligence gathering. Those things are real, and they are on the record, and you can read the declassified material yourself. So when Rourke was told that Phoenix 3 was studying the effects of powerful electromagnetic fields on human cognition, he did not think, this is monstrous. He thought, so that is where the power is going. He was shown, over his first weeks, a facility of remarkable size. Laboratories, machine shops, dormitories, a medical wing. Long corridors that were clearly older than the rest, poured concrete with the rough character of 1940s work, incorporated into the newer structure like the bones of an older animal inside a newer one. Rourke recognised them for what they were. Some of Phoenix 3 had been built into the original coastal artillery magazines and tunnels. The army had dug the first holes in the 1940s, and somebody, at some point, had come back and made them very much larger. And at the heart of it, in a room designated only as Laboratory 4, he was shown the chair. It sat in the centre of a circular room, and the room itself was the strange part. The walls were not walls. They were an assembly of coils and shielding and copper, layer upon layer of it, so that standing inside the room felt like standing inside the guts of a transformer. Cables as thick as a man's arm came in through conduits in the floor, and the cables, Rourke realised with a small cold shock of professional recognition, were the missing feed, the undocumented load, the hole in his ledger. It terminated here. The chair itself was almost disappointing. It looked like a dentist's chair that had been rebuilt by somebody with an obsession. Padded, reclining, wrapped in a lattice of coils and sensor leads, with a headpiece suspended above it like a hairdryer from a 1950s salon. And they explained to him what it did, and he did not believe them. The explanation went like this. If you place a human being inside a very carefully controlled electromagnetic field, and you modulate that field with great precision, certain subjects report unusual experiences. Most report nothing. Most report a headache and a metallic taste and a bad night's sleep. But a small percentage, perhaps 1 in several hundred, report something else. They report knowing things. At first it was subtle enough to be dismissed as coincidence, and the early researchers had dismissed it for years. Subjects in adjacent rooms would report the same dream. 2 people, sealed apart, would independently describe the same image. A subject would describe the contents of a sealed envelope in another part of the facility with better than chance accuracy. And then, slowly, the accuracy got worse for most subjects, and dramatically better for a few. And the few were the reason Phoenix 3 existed. They called it amplification. The hypothesis, as it was explained to Rourke, was that whatever faculty allows a very small number of human beings to occasionally perceive information they should not have access to, is an extraordinarily weak effect, drowned out by noise, unreliable to the point of uselessness. But if the effect is real, and if it is in some way electromagnetic in nature, then in principle it could be amplified. You would need an enormous, precisely controlled field. You would need, in fact, something roughly like a very large radar. And that, Rourke realised, standing in that copper room 130 feet under Montauk, was why nobody had ever been able to explain to him why the great dish turned to face the ground every Wednesday at 2 o'clock in the morning. The radar was not the base's mission. The radar was the base's amplifier. They had built a machine to make a whisper loud enough to hear. Rourke's job, once he had clearance, was straightforward and technically fascinating, and he threw himself into it with the enthusiasm of a man who has finally been handed a real problem. He was responsible for synchronization. The chair's field had to be phase-matched to the radar's output with a precision that was, frankly, at the outer edge of what 1970s electronics could achieve. Being a few microseconds out did not produce a weaker result. It produced no result at all, and occasionally it produced subjects who screamed. For the first several months Rourke was happy. That is the part he was most ashamed of later. He wrote about it in the notebook with a kind of raw disgust at himself. He said, "I need to record honestly that I enjoyed it. I need to record that I was proud of my work. I need to record that I did not ask a single question about the people in the chair for 111 days. The people in the chair were called subjects. They were referred to by number, not by name. That was standard practice, Rourke was told, to protect their privacy and to prevent researcher bias." It sounded reasonable. Almost everything at Phoenix 3 sounded reasonable, right up until the moment you looked directly at it. And the strongest of them all, the one everything eventually revolved around, was Subject 9. Rourke met him for the first time in the spring of 1974, and the meeting undid him. He had expected, without ever quite articulating it, a man, some volunteer, a soldier, perhaps, or a career test subject, one of those strange, hardy people who sign up for sleep deprivation studies in altitude chambers. Subject 9 was a boy. He was 17 years old. He was thin, with dark hair that needed cutting, and he had the specific flat watchfulness of a young person who has spent time in institutions. That way of looking at an adult that is simultaneously attentive and completely without expectation. He was sitting on a gurney outside Laboratory 4 with his shoes off, eating an orange, and when Rourke came around the corner, the boy looked up and said, "You're the power guy." Rourke said, "Yes." The boy said, "You should fix the hum. It's off. It's been off since Tuesday. It makes the whole thing taste like pennies." And Rourke stood in that corridor holding a clipboard and felt the floor tilt because the boy was right. There was a fault in one of the phase compensators. Rourke had found it that morning. It was a discrepancy so small that it did not affect any instrument in the building, and he had only found it because he had been looking for it deliberately, with equipment he had built himself. There was no possible way for a 17-year-old sitting in a hallway to know about it. His name, Rourke learned, was Daniel Vossler. Rourke was not supposed to learn that, but once he had, he could never go back to Subject 9, and something in the architecture of the whole place began, quietly, to fail. Here is the thing about a secret. It is never one secret. It is a stack of them, and each one is standing on the shoulders of a worse one, and the moment you are trusted with the top of the stack, you begin, inevitably, to feel the weight of everything underneath. Rourke had been told about the chair. He had been told about amplification. He had been told, in general terms, that the project used human volunteers. He had not been told where the volunteers came from. He found out slowly, the way you find out most terrible things in fragments that only become horrifying when you put them side by side. The first fragment was age. Rourke began paying attention to the subjects moving through the corridors, and he realized that almost all of them were young. Not children exactly, but adolescents and very young adults, 16, 17, 19. He asked about it, casually, and was given an answer that was almost certainly true, which is what made it so effective. He was told that response to the field appeared to correlate strongly with age, that the effect diminished sharply after the mid-20s, and that the working hypothesis involved neural plasticity. The developing brain is more flexible. The developing brain is easier to amplify. That is a real thing. Adolescent neuroplasticity is genuine science. The answer satisfied him for a while. The second fragment was paperwork. Rourke, in the course of tracing a grounding problem, spent an afternoon in a records room he had no particular reason to be in, and he noticed a filing cabinet of intake documents, and being an engineer with an incurable habit of reading things, he read some. The subjects came from institutions, not one institution, many. State psychiatric facilities, juvenile detention programs, group homes, foster placements, residential schools for troubled youth. There were referral forms with the letterheads of hospitals in 3 states, every single subject. As far as Rourke could tell, was a young person who did not have anybody. No parents in the picture, or parents who had signed away involvement. No siblings looking for them. No family lawyer. Nobody who would call. Nobody who would notice. And the intake documents did not describe the study accurately. They described a research program on the effects of environmental stress on adolescent cognition. They mentioned monitoring. They mentioned rest periods. They mentioned an educational component. They described, in short, a summer program. The word Rourke wrote in his notebook, and then crossed out and then wrote again, was harvested. Later, decades later, when the mythology of this place began circulating in books and at conventions and on late-night radio programs, these young people would be given a name. The stories would call them the Montauk Boys. In the conspiracy literature, they are described as abducted children, subjected to conditioning and experimentation, their memories deliberately destroyed and replaced. I want to be very clear with you here, because this is the part of the legend that matters most and deserves the most honesty. There is no credible evidence that any such program ever existed. No documentation, no records, no forensic trace. The claims come from a small number of people, decades after the fact, and they are not substantiated. But I want you to notice something, and then I want you to let it go and let yourself drift, because this is not a story to grip too tightly. Notice why the legend chose those particular victims. It did not choose the children of senators. It did not choose the sons of doctors in Connecticut. Every version of this myth, in every retelling, chose the young people that a society had already decided not to look for. Legends are honest in a way that people are not. They tell you what a culture is actually afraid of. And in the 1970s, in the long shadow of real revelations about real programs, about real institutions where real children were genuinely mistreated, with no oversight at all, the thing America was quietly afraid of was this: that if you were young enough and alone enough and nobody was coming for you, then someone could do anything they wanted to you and there would be no consequence at all. That fear did not need a conspiracy to be true. It only needed an institution and an absence of witnesses, which is why the story of the Montauk boys works. It is fiction built on the exact shape of a real whole. In the story, Nathaniel Rourke read those intake files, and he closed the drawer, and he went back to his office, and he did not sleep that night, or particularly well on any night afterward. And he began, quietly, to look after Daniel. It started small. It always does. He brought the boy a paperback novel from town because the facility library was mostly technical manuals and a shelf of extremely old magazines. He fixed the broken lamp in Daniel's room. He started timing his equipment checks to coincide with the boys' rest periods, so there would be somebody to talk to. They talked about ordinary things, cars mostly. Daniel loved cars in the specific encyclopedic way of a teenager who has never owned one and probably never will. He could tell you the displacement of every American engine built in the previous decade. He had opinions about them that he defended with total seriousness. Rourke, who drove a station wagon with a bad clutch, found himself losing arguments about carburetors to a 17-year-old 3 times a week and enjoying it enormously. And Daniel drew. That was the other thing. Between sessions, and especially after them, Daniel drew constantly on whatever he could find. Notebook paper, chart paper, the backs of printouts. He drew badly, in the way that most people draw, with no training and no particular skill, but with an obsessive attention to detail that made the drawings unsettling anyway. He drew Camp Hero, over and over and over, the tower, the buildings, the road up from the highway, but never as it was. He drew it ruined. In Daniel's drawings, the windows of the buildings were broken or missing. Small trees grew out of the roofs. The road was cracked and the cracks had grass in them. Chain-link fence lay collapsed in long tangles. The mess hall had no roof at all, only the outline of walls with sky inside them, and the tower stood, always, in every single drawing, whatever else had fallen down. The great dish stood above the ruin, intact. The first time Rourke saw one of these drawings, he laughed gently and said, "You know we're already at Camp Hero, right? You could just walk outside and look at it." And Daniel, without looking up from the page, said, "Not this one." Rourke asked him what he meant. Daniel thought about it for a while. He was not a dramatic boy. He did not enjoy being mysterious. He was clearly trying to describe something he did not have adequate words for, and the effort visibly frustrated him. Finally he said, "When I'm in the chair, sometimes I go somewhere, and sometimes it's here. But it's after." "After what?" Rourke asked. Daniel said, "After everybody leaves. That should have been the moment." Rourke wrote later that he thought about that conversation more than any other, and that everything he did afterward was, in some sense, an apology for how he responded to it, because what he did was nod and file it away as the strange poetry of a strange kid and go back to work. The sessions themselves were, by then, running with a precision Rourke had helped build. The protocol was standardized. A subject would be seated in the chair. Baseline physiological readings would be taken. The radar would be brought up on the surface and phase locked to the field generators below, which took, on a good night, about 11 minutes. Then a sealed target would be introduced. Sometimes it was a photograph in an envelope, sometimes it was a location described only by coordinates, written down by a researcher who did not know what those coordinates referred to, so that nobody in the room could accidentally leak the answer. And then the subject would talk, and a stenographer would write down every word. Most subjects produced nothing usable. Vague impressions, colours, the kind of material you could map onto almost anything after the fact. Daniel produced floor plans. He described the interiors of buildings. He described the number of vehicles in a parking area and where the damaged one was. He described a water stain on a ceiling in a room in a building 400 miles away, and when a photograph was eventually obtained, the water stain was there. And then came the session that changed everything, and it changed everything by accident, because of a clerical error. In the autumn of 1975, Daniel was given a set of coordinates that the project believed corresponded to a Soviet research installation. This was the entire justification for Phoenix 3's continued funding. Remote observation of hardened facilities. That was the pitch. That was what kept the lights on. Daniel sat in the chair, and the tower turned to face the ground, and the field came up, and for 40 minutes he described what he found there. He described a facility. He described low buildings arranged around a central yard. He described a large structure with a curved roof and a row of tall, narrow ventilation stacks. He described trucks with a specific kind of high-sided bed. He described a fence line that ran along a slope and turned at an angle around a stand of trees. He described a water tower with rust on one side. He described, and the stenographer got all of it, an analyst spent 3 weeks trying to match it to any known Soviet installation. They could not. Because someone had transposed 2 figures on the coordinate sheet. The location Daniel had been given was not in the Soviet Union. It was not overseas at all. It was in rural Pennsylvania. And in 1975, that location was an empty field. Nothing there. 60 acres of soybeans and a drainage ditch and a stand of trees at the top of a slope. The session was written off. The paperwork was filed as a procedural failure, and the analysts moved on, and the incident became an office joke, the kind of thing people bring up at the end of a long shift. Remember when Nine spent 40 minutes doing a beautiful reading of a soybean farm? 4 years later, in 1979, an analyst reviewing something else entirely came across a note about new construction at a site in Pennsylvania, a private industrial facility. Low buildings arranged around a central yard, a large structure with a curved roof and ventilation stacks, a fence line running along a slope, turning at an angle around a stand of trees, and a water tower. Rourke was in the room when the photographs were laid out beside the 1975 transcript. Nobody spoke for a long time. Then Dr. Isadora Vey, the project director, said something that Rourke wrote down that same night, word for word, because he understood even in the moment that it was the hinge on which everything would turn. She said, "We've been assuming that the limiting factor was distance." And then she said, "I do not think distance is the variable. Let me tell you about Dr. Isadora Vey, because she is the most dangerous kind of person in any story like this one. She was not cruel. That is what makes her frightening. If you want a villain who enjoys hurting people, you will have to look somewhere else tonight, because Isadora Vey did not enjoy anything, as far as Rourke could tell, except the moment when a hypothesis turned out to be correct. She was in her early 50s. She had come up through a physics background and moved sideways into the strange interdisciplinary borderland where the intelligence community kept its most speculative money. She wore the same grey cardigan almost every day. She remembered the names of every technician's children. She was, by all accounts, unfailingly polite. And she had the specific moral blindness of a person who has decided that a question is more important than the people required to answer it. After Pennsylvania, Vey reorganized the entire premise of Phoenix 3. Her reasoning went like this, and I want you to follow it slowly because it is the last moment in this story where anything makes ordinary sense. If Daniel had described a Soviet base, That would have been remarkable but explicable within the project's existing framework. Consciousness perceives a distant place. Fine. Strange, but bounded. But Daniel had not described a place. He had described a place at a time. He had described a facility that did not exist in 1975 and would exist in 1979 in accurate detail, 4 years early. Which meant the thing he was doing was not looking across space. The distance had never been the difficult part. The difficult part all along, without anybody realizing it, had been aiming. And if that were true, Vey argued, then the sessions had been badly designed from the very beginning. They had been giving subjects coordinates, and coordinates specify only 3 of the 4 numbers you need to identify a location in this universe. They had been leaving the 4th one blank, and then acting surprised when the answers came back from unpredictable places. Every session for 6 years, every strange partial result, every subject who described a room correctly except for the furniture, or a building correctly except that the wing on the north side was missing, or a road correctly except that it was dirt instead of paved. They had not been failures. They had been accurate readings of the correct place at the wrong time. Rourke sat in that briefing and felt something move in his chest that was not excitement, though it was next to excitement, the way nausea is next to hunger. Because he understood immediately what the next question would be. Every engineer does. Once you can observe a system, someone always asks whether you can touch it. The new protocol took 18 months to develop. Rourke built most of the hardware. The core change was simple to state and monstrously difficult to implement. Along with a spatial target, the subject would now be given a temporal one. And to make that possible, the field had to do something it had never done, which was to hold 2 states at once, matched not only in phase with the radar, but in a relationship Vey described using mathematics that Rourke could follow for about 6 lines before it left him behind entirely. They tested it small. They asked Daniel to describe the underground corridor outside Laboratory 4 as it had been on a specific date the previous year, and he described a floor that had since been retiled correctly, including a chip in the old tile near the door frame that 3 long-serving technicians independently remembered. They asked for other dates, other rooms. The accuracy was inconsistent, and the Airtians cost Daniel more than the old ones had. He came out of them grey-faced. He lost weight. His nosebleeds, which had always been occasional, became routine, and after one session in the spring of 1977 he could not remember the name of the state he was in for almost 2 hours. Rourke raised it. He raised it formally, in writing, twice. The response, both times, was that subject welfare was a medical matter, and that Mr. Rourke's responsibilities were technical. And then came the night of the 21st of September, 1977. They ran the field at a level it had never been run at before. Rourke's own synchronization equipment was operating outside the envelope he had designed it for, and he said so, and he was overruled, and he stayed at his console because the alternative was leaving Daniel down there alone with people who would not stop. The target was not a distant place at all. That was Vey's insight and her recklessness in a single stroke. The target was that same room, Laboratory 4, same coordinates, same walls, same floor, 10 years earlier, 1967. The radar came around and tilted down. The field came up, and Daniel, strapped in with the headpiece lowered, was told to visualize the room he was already sitting in, exactly as it had been 10 years before. The first thing that happened was the cold. The temperature in Laboratory 4 dropped, faster than any ventilation failure could account for. Frost appeared on the outer surface of the coil housings. 2 technicians reported a pain in their inner ears. The stenographer's pen stopped writing because the ink had thickened. The second thing that happened was the failure of the instruments. Not a shutdown, something stranger. Meters began reading values that were not merely wrong, but incoherent. A chart recorder drew a line that went off the top of the paper, and then, according to 2 witnesses, was already at the bottom of the page without having crossed the middle. And the third thing that happened was the distortion. It appeared about 4 feet above the floor, in the open space between the chair and the northern wall. It was not a hole. Rourke was very insistent about this in everything he wrote afterward. It was not a glowing portal or a spinning vortex or anything that would look impressive in a film. He said it looked like a section of the room had been very slightly misprinted, like a page where one colour has been laid down a fraction out of register with the others, and through that misprinted section of air they could see the room, the same room. But the coils on the north wall were absent, and the wall behind them was bare concrete with a painted number on it, and there was a wooden equipment cart standing where no cart stood, and the light was different, warmer, from fixtures that had been replaced years before, Laboratory 4 in 1967. It lasted, by the most reliable account, 11 seconds, and in the 9th second Dr. Isadora Vey took a coin out of her cardigan pocket, and she threw it. Rourke saw it go. He said it did not slow down or flash or make any sound. It simply left her hand, crossed the misprinted air and was gone, and a half-second later the distortion folded up, and the room was only the room again, and the temperature began climbing back toward normal. Daniel was unconscious. He would remain unconscious for 19 hours, and the coin was nowhere in Laboratory 4. They searched, of course. They took up the floor panels. They ran a magnetometer over the entire room. It was a 1964 quarter, and Vey had marked it that afternoon with 2 small scratches across the eagle, because she had been intending to do this for weeks and had told no one. It was not in the room. 3 days later, an archivist named Mary Okonkwo, who had been given a very narrow question and no explanation for it, delivered a folder to Vey's office. It contained maintenance logs from 1967. And in the log for the 21st of September 1967, in the handwriting of a technician who had died of a heart attack in 1971, was an entry noting that during a routine inspection of the laboratory space, a United States $quarter had been recovered from the floor near the north wall. The entry noted, with the mild irritation of a man documenting a nuisance, that the coin was scratched across the eagle, that the room had been sealed and unoccupied for 11 days, and that no explanation for its presence could be determined. The coin had been logged, tagged, and placed in a supply drawer, where it had presumably sat for a while, and then been spent by somebody on a cup of coffee. Rourke stood in Vey's office and read that entry, and then he read it again. And then he had to sit down, because look at what it means. Sit with it for a moment, and then let it go, and let yourself sink a little deeper into the mattress. The coin arrived in 1967. It arrived before Vey threw it. It had already been there, been found, been logged, and been spent for 10 entire years before the woman who threw it had made the decision to throw it. During all of 1968 and 1969 and every year after, while Vey was still deciding whether the project was even viable, the outcome of her decision was already sitting in a supply drawer at Camp Hero, which raises the question that nobody in that room said out loud. Could she have chosen not to throw it? And if she could not have, then what exactly was it that she experienced that afternoon when she reached into her cardigan pocket and felt herself decide? After the coin, everything at Phoenix 3 accelerated, and the facility itself began to go wrong. The missing time started within weeks. Rourke was the first to document it, though he was almost certainly not the first to experience it. He arrived at his console one Tuesday morning, sat down, opened his logbook, and discovered that it was 4 hours later than it had been a moment earlier, and that his own handwriting filled 2 pages he had no memory of writing. The notes were technical. They were correct. They resolved a problem he had been stuck on for a week. He did not tell anyone for 9 days. Then he mentioned it, obliquely, to a technician named Ruiz, and Ruiz went very still and said, "How long do you lose?" Ruiz was losing whole afternoons. A machinist named Bell had come to work 3 times on days that were not his shift, and had no memory of the drive. A woman in medical had a conversation with a colleague about a patient in detail, and the colleague had that same conversation with her 4 days later, and neither of them could work out which one had happened first. Documents began appearing, not many, perhaps a dozen over the following year, and they were the most quietly terrifying thing in the entire facility. They were internal memoranda on the correct letterhead in the correct format containing correct information, instructions for procedural changes, a revised maintenance schedule, a calibration table for equipment Rourke had built containing values he had not yet calculated. That turned out to be right. Nobody could identify who had written them. Nobody could remember typing them. The typewriter ribbons were checked and matched machines within the building. And then Rourke found the photograph. He was looking for something else. He was in an archive room, going through boxes of site documentation from the Air Force period, trying to establish the original routing of a power feed. And in a box of general photographs, most of them dull, most of them ceremonial, he found a group picture taken outside the northern building. The caption on the back, in pencil, gave a date, March 1962. 11 men standing in 2 rows, Air Force uniforms on 4 of them, civilian clothes on the rest. Third from the left, in the back row, wearing a coat Rourke did not own, at an age Rourke would not reach for another 11 years, was Nathaniel Rourke. He was not smiling. He was looking slightly off to the side of the camera, the way a man looks when someone has just called his name, and he was, unmistakably, exactly the age Rourke was in 1977. Not younger, not a relative, not a resemblance. Him, as he was now, standing in a photograph taken when he was 17 years old and living with his mother in Buffalo. Rourke took the photograph. He simply put it inside his jacket and walked out with it, which was a serious offence, and he did not care, and nobody ever noticed. He spent the next 5 months conducting a private investigation into the history of the thing he was building, and what he found was worse than the photograph. It began with a component. Rourke had inherited, when he took over synchronization, a sub-assembly that everyone called the ladder, a phase compensation stage that was central to the entire system. He had modified it, improved it, rebuilt it twice, but the core design was not his. It had been there when he arrived. He wanted to know who had designed it, because there was a subtlety in it, a compensation for a resonance effect that was genuinely elegant, and he wanted to talk to the person who had thought of it. The engineering drawings for the ladder were in the archive. They were dated 1971. They were unsigned. The change orders that produced them referenced a source document, and the source document was in a different file, and it was a set of specifications that had, according to the routing sheet, been received by Phoenix 3 rather than generated by it. Received from where? The routing sheet said only internal transfer, project priority, no distribution. Rourke kept pulling. He was patient and he was methodical, and he had a great deal of clearance and absolutely no supervision, because everyone above him was consumed by the aftermath of the coin. He found 4 more instances, 4 core components of the Phoenix 3 system, including the field modulation topology itself, the actual heart of the machine, had entered the project as complete specifications from an unidentified internal source, with no design history, no prototypes, no iterations. Just finished answers. That is not how engineering works. Rourke knew this the way a doctor knows anatomy. Real designs have scars. They have earlier versions that failed. They have a paper trail of people being wrong. These had none. They had arrived perfect, the way a copy arrives perfect. And then he found the thing that made him stop looking. In a sealed folder, in a cabinet in Vay's outer office, which he opened at 2 a.m. with a key he was not supposed to have, Rourke found a set of specifications that had not yet been distributed. They were dated with a receipt stamp from the previous month. They described modifications to the synchronization system. They were in his handwriting. They described work he had not done, using a notation system he had personally invented 18 months earlier and shared with no one. They contained a correction to an error he had not yet discovered, and in the margin, in his own hand, in his own particular way of crossing a letter T, someone had written a note. It said, "Do not run August 12th. It said, "Whatever they tell you, do not run it." Rourke sat on the floor of that office in the dark for a long time. because he understood finally what Phoenix 3 actually was. It was not a research project that had discovered how to look through time. It was a machine that had been built out of information sent backward by its own future. The specifications that made the machine possible had come from experiments that could only be conducted using the machine those specifications made possible. There was no first design. There was no inventor. If you trace the origin of the technology backward, you did not arrive at a person having an idea. You arrived at a circle. Rourke wrote in his notebook that night a sentence that a journalist would read out loud on a recording many years later. He wrote, "Nobody built this. It built itself, and it used us to do it." Now let me step out of the story for a moment and tell you something real, because the last act of this tale depends on a piece of American folklore that you may already know. There is a very old legend called the Philadelphia Experiment. The claim, in its usual form, is that in 1943 the United States Navy conducted a secret test at the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard involving a destroyer escort, and that in the course of an attempt at making the vessel invisible to detection, something went catastrophically wrong. Depending on which version you hear, the ship vanished, or teleported, or moved through time, and crewmen were injured in ways that do not bear describing. Historians and the Navy have addressed this repeatedly. There is no credible evidence that anything of the kind occurred. The Office of Naval Research has stated plainly that it did not happen. The story appears to originate largely from letters written in the 1950s by a single individual, and it grew from there through books and films into one of the most durable legends in American conspiracy culture. I am telling you this so that you know exactly where we stand. The Philadelphia Experiment is not history, it is folklore. But folklore has gravity, and in the 1980s, when the Montauk mythology first began to be written down and sold, its authors did something clever. They attached their new legend to the old one. They said the two were connected. They said the date mattered. And so in our story, in the summer of 1983, Phoenix 3 began preparing for an experiment scheduled for the 12th of August. 40 years to the day after the date traditionally associated with the Philadelphia incident. The proposal that Rourke read, and did not believe he was reading, described the objective as the establishment of a stable temporal corridor with a fixed displacement of 40 years. Not an observation, not a window, a corridor, something that could be entered and held open and used. And Vey's justification for the specific target, buried in an appendix in her own careful handwriting, made Rourke's skin crawl. She wrote that the anomaly of 1943 had never been satisfactorily explained. She wrote that the reported effects were consistent with an unstable temporal event of the type Phoenix had been producing at small scale for 6 years. And she wrote that if such an event had occurred in 1943, it had almost certainly not occurred in isolation, because their own data indicated that a corridor requires 2 ends. Something had to be pulling from the other side. The proposal's conclusion was 1 sentence long. We now believe we have always been the other side. Do you see the shape of it? In this version of the legend, the sailors at Philadelphia were not the experimenters. They were the ones who got caught in the doorway. They were standing at one end of a tunnel that somebody would begin digging 40 years later from the far end, and they did not know it, and could not have known it, because the people digging had not been born yet. 2 teams, working on opposite ends of the same excavation, separated by 4 decades, neither aware the other existed, and a small number of ordinary men in 1943 standing exactly where the tunnel came through. Rourke tried to stop it. I want you to know that he tried, because the rest of this story is not kind to anyone, and it matters that he tried. He went to Vey directly and told her that the synchronization system could not hold at the power levels the corridor required, which was true. She showed him a modified specification that solved the problem. It was, of course, the specification he had found in the sealed folder, in his handwriting. The one with the warning in the margin, which had been carefully removed from the copy that reached her. He went above her. He wrote a formal technical objection through the correct channel to an oversight office in Virginia, whose existence he had learned about by accident. He received an acknowledgement card. Nothing else, ever. He tried to take Daniel out. That is the part that hurts, and I will tell it quickly, because you are trying to sleep, and there is no reason for me to dwell here. Daniel was 27 years old by 1983. He had been in that facility, in one capacity or another, for 11 years. He had never had an address of his own. He had never had a driver's license, despite knowing the displacement of every engine built in America between 1960 and 1972. He was thin in a way that frightened Rourke, and the nosebleeds had become something worse, and there were long stretches when he did not seem entirely certain which year it was, and he had begun, in the last months, to occasionally answer questions that had not been asked yet. Rourke told him, in a corridor, quietly, that there was a way out, that he had money, that he had a friend in Vermont, that they could leave in the fall and Daniel could be a person, an actual person, with a car and a job and a bad apartment and a life so ordinary it would bore him. And Daniel looked at him with enormous patience, the way you look at a child who is explaining something to you that you have known for years. He said, "Nate, I've seen the 12th. He said, "I've seen it from the inside about 100 times. He said, "You don't get me out. You never get me out. Please stop trying, because in the ones where you keep trying, it goes worse." And then he said the thing that Rourke could not get out of his head for the rest of his life. He said it lightly, almost cheerfully. That was the worst part. He said, "But there's a version where I get to choose what comes through." The 12th of August, 1983 was a Friday. It was hot on Long Island that week, the kind of thick coastal heat that sits on the water and does not move. Above ground, Camp Hero looked exactly as it had looked for 30 years, which is to say it looked like almost nothing at all. Some low buildings, some chain link, scrub pine and salt air, and the great grey dish turning slowly against a hazy sky. Down below, at 130 feet, Phoenix 3 went to full power at 11 minutes past 2 in the afternoon. Rourke was at his console. He had thought seriously about not coming in. He had sat in his car at the gate that morning for 11 minutes with the engine running, and then he had parked, because Daniel was going to be in that room whether or not Rourke was at the console, and if Rourke was at the console, then at least there would be one hand on the equipment that belonged to someone who cared what happened to the boy. The corridor opened faster than anyone expected. That was the first indication that something was different. In every previous run, the effect had taken minutes to build and had felt like pushing something uphill. This time the field locked almost instantly, as though the geometry it was trying to establish was already there, waiting, and all they had done was switch on a light in a room that had been dark, which, if you follow the logic of everything Rourke had learned in the archive, is probably exactly what happened. The corridor did not need to be created. It had been created. It was one of the things that had always been true about the 12th of August, 1983, in the same way that the coin had always been in the drawer. The distortion appeared in the centre of Laboratory 4, and it was not 11 seconds this time, and it was not 4 feet wide. It grew. The instrument readings from the first 90 seconds survive in Rourke's own notes, and they describe an event that was consuming power in a way the system should not have been able to supply. He watched the load climb past every limit he had built, and the limits did not trip, and he began to understand that his equipment was no longer entirely in control of what was happening, because the corridor had found another source. It was drawing from the other end, and through the distortion for a period of perhaps 2 minutes, people in that room saw water, not a wall, not a fixed image, a shifting, unstable view, sometimes clear and sometimes almost gone, of dark water at night, and beyond it lights, and something enormous and dark and metal. And Rourke, who had grown up near shipyards, said afterward that what he saw through that opening was a hull. There were men on it. He would not describe what they were doing. He wrote, in the notebook, only, "I will not put down what I saw on the deck, and if the tapes survive, then that is enough, and I am sorry." And then Daniel changed the target. Nobody realised it at first. He was supposed to be holding the anchor point, keeping the far end of the corridor fixed on the specified date, and instead, somewhere in the 3rd minute, without any change in the equipment, the view of the water simply stopped. They called for a status. Technicians reported the field was stable. The corridor was open, but the far end was no longer where they had put it. Daniel's voice came over the intercom from inside Laboratory 4, and Rourke said it was completely calm, and that he had never once heard the boy sound like that before. He said, "I'm not going where you want anymore. They ordered a shutdown." Rourke's hands were already on the controls, and it would not shut down. The synchronization system had, at some point in the previous minutes, stopped being the thing that determined the state of the field and had become the thing that reported on it. Rourke pulled the sequence completed, the readouts confirmed shutdown, and the corridor stayed open because the corridor was no longer being powered from Camp Hero. Now, here is the part of the legend that everyone knows, even if they know nothing else about Montauk. If you have heard of this place at all outside of conspiracy circles, you have probably heard of a creature. That association is a genuine tangle of two entirely separate things, and I want to untangle it for you honestly. In 2008, the carcass of a small dead animal washed up on a beach in Montauk. Somebody photographed it. The photograph circulated. It had a hairless, bloated body and an odd beak-like face, and it did not look like anything a casual observer could name, and the internet, being the internet, called it the Montauk Monster. The most widely accepted explanation among biologists who examine the photographs is that it was a raccoon in an advanced state of decomposition. Water does terrible things to a corpse. Hair comes away, soft tissue swells and then collapses. The nose and lips of a raccoon decompose before the underlying bone, and what remains looks disturbingly like a beak. That is almost certainly all it was. A drowned raccoon that came ashore at the wrong time in the wrong condition, on a beach that happened to sit downhill from an abandoned military base that people already told stories about. The creature and the conspiracy have nothing to do with one another. They simply share a place name, and a place name is enough. That is how folklore assembles itself, not by conspiracy, but by proximity. In our story, though, something did come through, and it did not come from Philadelphia. Daniel had been asked for 11 years to look at places he was given, and in all that time nobody had ever asked him what he saw when nobody was steering. He had told Rourke once in a hallway, months earlier. It had come out sideways, as an aside, and Rourke had not understood it as a confession until much later. Daniel had said that when he was a child in one of the institutions before Montauk, he used to have a recurring dream, and that in the dream there was a thing in the room with him, and that the reason the dream was so bad was not that the thing was hostile. It was that the thing was interested. On the 12th of August, 1983, with a temporal corridor open and drawing power from something on the other side of it, Daniel Vossler stopped concentrating on a shipyard in 1943 and thought, instead, about the thing from his dream. And the corridor obliged. Rourke's account of the next 11 minutes is fragmentary, and he admits it. He says that the lights failed in stages. He says that people in the observation gallery began screaming before anything visible had happened, which he later thought was the worst detail of all, because it suggests that whatever came through was perceptible to some part of the mind before it was perceptible to the eye. He says that the temperature dropped so far that the emergency lighting fogged. He says he saw it for less than 2 seconds, through the observation glass, and that his description would not be useful, because his mind had clearly refused to encode it properly. He wrote that it was large, and that it was wrong in its proportions in a way that made him feel like his eyes were failing, and that it moved as though it were being animated by something with only a theoretical understanding of how bodies work. And he wrote one line about it that has stayed with everyone who has ever read that notebook. He wrote, "It did not come through hunting. It came through curious. That is worse." Here is the interpretation the story offers, and it is the reason this version of the Montauk legend is more disturbing than the usual one. Daniel did not create a monster with his mind. That would be a comfort in a way. That would mean it came from inside a human being, and that human beings are the only thing in the dark. Daniel opened a door, and on the other side of that door was a place where the thing from his childhood dream was already living, and had been living, all along, and had perhaps been visiting a lonely child in an institution, in exactly the way that a person might put their eye to a small hole in a wall. The dream was not a dream. It was a line of sight, and in 1983, somebody handed that child enough power to turn a line of sight into a doorway. What followed, in the story, is chaos, and I am not going to linger in it, because you are lying in the dark, and this is the part of the night when a story should begin letting go of you rather than gripping you tighter. The underground complex began to come apart, not physically, but temporally. Rourke, making his way through failing corridors toward the machine room, passed through sections of Phoenix 3 that were not entirely in 1983 anymore. He wrote that in one corridor he walked through raw poured concrete tunnel, unfinished, with wooden formwork still in place and the smell of fresh cement, which is to say, Camp Hero in the 1940s. He wrote that in another he stood for several seconds in a room full of equipment he did not recognise, with men in Air Force uniforms of an older cut who did not react to him at all. And he wrote about one opening that he could not stop thinking about for the rest of his life. He looked through it and saw the surface. He saw Camp Hero above ground, in daylight, and the buildings had broken windows and small trees growing out of their roofs, and the road was cracked with grass in the cracks, and the chain link lay collapsed in long tangles. And the tower was still standing, intact, above the ruin. And it was turning. There was nobody there. The base was empty and had been empty for years. And the great dish was rotating steadily, exactly as it had rotated when it was manned, sweeping a sky that no longer had anyone watching it. He had seen that view before. He had seen it dozens of times in pencil on the backs of printouts, drawn by a boy who could not draw. Rourke reached the machine room, and he destroyed the synchronization system. He did it with a fire axe, and then, when the axe was not enough, with a wrench and with his hands, and he was badly burned doing it, and he kept going. He did not disable the equipment. He annihilated it. He destroyed the phase compensators, the ladder, the modulation topology, every component that had arrived in that facility as a finished answer with no history. He destroyed the components that had come from the future, which means, if you follow the loop all the way around, that Nathaniel Rourke is the reason those specifications had to be sent backward in the first place. There were no prototypes because there could not be any. The originals were destroyed by the only man who understood them well enough to know exactly where to hit. The corridor collapsed. The distortion folded up and was gone. The temperature in the complex began to climb back toward normal. The emergency light steadied. The creature, whatever it was not in Laboratory 4, and was not anywhere else in the complex, and was never found, and no trace of it was ever recovered. And neither was Daniel. The chair was empty. The straps were unfastened, not broken. The headpiece was raised. There was no body. There was no blood. There was nothing in that room to indicate that a 27-year-old man had been sitting in it 11 minutes earlier. Just a chair and a notebook on the floor beside it. And on the open page, in handwriting, Rourke knew very well 3 words. It says, "Told you so." Phoenix 3 was terminated within 72 hours. Not wound down, not reduced. Terminated in the way that a thing is terminated when the people responsible for it have decided that the most valuable possible outcome is for it to have never existed. Personnel were reassigned individually to different states on different days, so that no 2 of them left together. Equipment was removed or destroyed in place. The lower sections were sealed, and the corridors leading to them were filled, and the elevator shaft in the northern building was capped with a concrete plug, and a floor was poured over it. And here is the beautiful, terrible convenience of the whole thing. Camp Hero was already scheduled to close. The radar station's operational life was ending anyway. That was public. That was budgeted. That was in the record. The Air Force was shutting down its Montauk operations, and the site was going to be abandoned regardless of anything that did or did not happen in a laboratory 130 feet underground. So nobody needed to invent a cover story. The truth, the ordinary and boring and entirely documented truth, that an obsolete radar station was being decommissioned at the end of Long Island, did all of the work for them. Any strange infrastructure discovered later could be explained by the base's genuine history. Any sealed structure could be explained by coastal artillery. Any unexplained power capacity could be explained by the radar. Any unusual construction could be explained by 4 decades of military use across 2 wars. Every single anomaly at Camp Hero had a legitimate, verifiable explanation available, because Camp Hero had been genuinely strange for 40 years before Phoenix ever existed. The perfect hiding place is not somewhere nobody looks. It is somewhere that already has an answer for every question. Nathaniel Rourke was not arrested. He was not threatened. At least not in any way he could have described to a lawyer. He was given a medical discharge from his contract, a severance payment that was noticeably generous, and a set of documents to sign that he signed without reading, because his hands were bandaged and he no longer cared. He moved to a small town in upstate New York. He took a job maintaining electrical systems for a school district, which he did competently and without complaint for 26 years. He never married. He kept a notebook. He kept a photograph from 1962 that he could not throw away and could not look at. And at some point in the late 1990s, when he was in his 50s, he bought a tape recorder and began, in the evenings, to talk into it. Now, the legend. In the early 1990s, books began to appear claiming that extraordinary experiments had been conducted beneath Camp Hero. The claims involved mind control, psychic research, kidnapped young people, underground laboratories, connections to the Philadelphia experiment, and the manipulation of time. The most prominent names associated with popularizing this mythology are Preston Nichols and Peter Moon, whose books built the framework that every later retelling has borrowed from. Their claims have never been substantiated. There is no documentary evidence, no physical evidence, and no independent corroboration for the Montauk project as described in that literature. The overwhelming consensus among historians, journalists, and the actual staff of the state park is that it did not happen. And the claims are, it must be said, extremely difficult to take seriously. They ask you to believe in psychic children, in a chair that amplifies consciousness, in a beast summoned out of a nightmare, and in a doorway cut through 40 years of time. Which brings us to the last and cleverest idea in the whole legend. In our story, when Rourke finally spoke, he did not talk about the cover-up as something the government had to work at. He said the opposite. He said the government did nothing at all, because consider what happened. A story leaked out of Montauk that contained, buried within it, some genuinely dangerous truths about what had been done to vulnerable young people in an unaccountable institution. And that story reached the public wrapped in psychic children and time travel and a monster. What is the response of a reasonable person? The reasonable person laughs. The reasonable person says this is absurd and stops reading and never gets to the part about the intake forms from the psychiatric institutions, or the young people with nobody looking for them, or the fact that a documented American intelligence establishment genuinely did spend decades funding research into the manipulation of the human mind. Rourke's argument was that the most extraordinary elements of the legend function as camouflage, not despite being unbelievable, but precisely because they are unbelievable, that a truth wrapped in enough absurdity becomes self-sealing, that you do not need to suppress a story if you can arrange for it to arrive already sounding like a joke. The government, in his telling, never had to lift a finger. They simply let Montauk become folklore, and folklore is the one form of information that cannot be prosecuted, cannot be verified and cannot hurt anyone in a position of power ever again, which is a genuinely uncomfortable thought, and I will leave it with you gently because it applies well beyond this one small headland in New York. The final chapter of the story belongs to a woman I have not introduced yet, and I will introduce her briefly because it is late and we are nearly at the end. In 2011, an investigative journalist working on an entirely unrelated story about the decommissioning of Cold War sites received a package with no return address. Inside were 4 audio cassettes and a photocopy of a photograph dated March 1962. Nathaniel Rourke had died 2 years earlier. He had left instructions with an attorney. The tapes are long and rambling, and the voice on them is old and often tired. Most of it is technical. Some of it is grief. He talks about a boy who loved cars at length, more than he talks about the physics. But near the end of the 4th tape, Rourke says something that the journalist went back and listened to 11 times. He says, "I want to be clear, because I have thought about this for 30 years and I am fairly sure of it now. Daniel did not die in that room. I have gone over the power figures more times than any sane man would. When the corridor collapsed, it did not close on him. He was in it. He says, I think he is still in it. I think that is what he chose. Not out and not dead. In between." And then Rourke laughs on the tape, which is the only time in 4 hours that he does. He says he always said he could see all the versions. Maybe the one he picked was the one where he doesn't have to be in any of them. The journalist did what journalists do. She filed requests. She sent letters. She read declassified indexes for 2 years. And she found almost nothing, which is what you would expect, because almost nothing is what there is. But she found 3 references in 3 different documents from 3 different agencies that use the same project name. Phoenix 4, dated August 2003. Phoenix 5, dated August 2023. Every 20,023, every 20 years, always in August. That was disturbing enough. But it was not the thing that made her stop working on the story for 8 months and sleep with a light on. The thing that did that was a single page from a Phoenix 3 technical file, obtained through a request that had been pending for so long she had forgotten filing it. The page was a routing sheet. Standard form. Receive specifications, internal transfer, no distribution. It was date-stamped 1977, and in the subject line, typed by somebody at Camp Hero 6 years before the 12th of August, 1983, and 26 years before anyone had heard of Phoenix 4, was a reference number. It referenced the 2023 experiment. Sit with that for a moment, softly, and then let it go. The program was not progressing forward through time. Every experiment sends information backward to the experiment before it, which means the machine that ran in 1983 was built from specifications sent by the machine that ran in 2003, which was built from specifications sent by the machine that ran in 2023, and so on. Forward and backward, around and around, a snake with its own tail in its mouth. And after enough decades of that, nobody involved can tell you which end of the program came first. Not because the records were destroyed, because there is no answer, because the question may not mean anything. And that leaves us with the last thought I want to give you tonight, the one to carry down with you as you fall. We have been assuming this entire time that scientists came to Montauk and invented something. That the story runs, people arrived, people experimented, people discovered. But if information moves backward through this program, then consider the other possibility. Consider that somebody in a windowless office, in the early 1950s, opened a file that had arrived through internal transfer with no distribution, and read a set of specifications that no one could account for. And in that file was the location. Not a recommendation, not a proposal, a statement. Consider that they built the Montauk project at Camp Hero, on that particular windswept headland at the end of Long Island, for one reason only. Because a document from the future told them that they already had. Before we dive into tonight's story, I want to give a huge shout out to Tyler for suggesting this topic. The Hanging Gardens conspiracy is exactly the kind of deep mystery that keeps us up at night, and I think you're going to love where this investigation takes us. Now let's talk about something that shouldn't exist but does, or rather, something that should exist but doesn't. Among the 7 wonders of the ancient world, only one has never been found. Not a trace, not a foundation stone, not a single confirmed artifact. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon are described in vivid detail by ancient historians, poets who wrote of impossible greenery cascading down terraced stone, of waterfalls flowing upward through desert heat, of trees from distant lands thriving where nothing should grow. Yet after centuries of excavation, the site remains a ghost. Archaeologists have turned over every stone in ancient Babylon searching for evidence of this legendary marvel, and the silence is deafening. The question isn't just where the gardens were. The question is how they could have existed at all. How did ancient engineers irrigate forests rising hundreds of feet into the air without the machinery we rely on today? The answer may be far stranger than anyone imagined, and it changes everything we thought we knew about the technological capabilities of the ancient world. Picture yourself standing in the dusty excavation sites outside modern-day Hilla, Iraq, where ancient Babylon once dominated the Mesopotamian plain. The sun beats down mercilessly, the same sun that baked this land 3,000 years ago. Archaeologists work carefully through layers of earth, each shovelful potentially containing fragments of one of history's greatest civilizations. They find pottery shards, cuneiform tablets, the foundations of temples and palaces. But of the Hanging Gardens, supposedly the most spectacular structure ever built in this city, they find nothing. It's as if the most famous landmark of ancient Babylon simply never existed. Yet the descriptions are too consistent, too detailed to dismiss as pure fantasy. Greek and Roman historians writing centuries apart describe the same impossible structure. Terraced gardens rising in massive stone tiers, each level thick with soil supporting full-grown trees. Waterfalls cascading from level to level. The scent of flowers mixing with the acrid smell of the desert. And everywhere, the impossible sight of lush vegetation thriving where nothing should grow, sustained by water that appeared to flow upward against gravity itself. The ancient writers struggled to explain what they were seeing. They used words like magic, divine intervention, the work of gods. But they also tried to provide mechanical explanations, descriptions of chain pumps and water screws that might account for the irrigation. These explanations satisfied historians for centuries. They fit within our understanding of what ancient technology could accomplish. Simple machines, human labour, clever engineering working within the constraints of Bronze Age capabilities. But what if the ancient writers were describing something they genuinely didn't understand? What if they were trying to explain advanced technology using the only vocabulary available to them? When you read their accounts with fresh eyes, something else emerges. A pattern of details that don't quite fit the standard explanation. References to constant moisture in the air even during drought seasons. Descriptions of the gardens glowing at night with a peculiar luminescence. Mentions of strange sounds, humming or resonating tones that seem to come from the structure itself. Reports that metal objects near the gardens would sometimes spark or create small shocks. These details get dismissed as embellishment, the mythologizing that happens when stories are passed down through generations. But what if they're not embellishments? What if they're accurate observations of phenomena the ancient writers couldn't explain? The clues were always there, hidden in plain sight within the classical texts. We just weren't looking for them. We assumed ancient peoples were primitive, that advanced technology is a modern invention, that our linear progression from simple to complex is how human development must work. The Hanging Gardens are about to force us to reconsider everything we think we know about the ancient world. Because beneath the sand of Mesopotamia, something is waiting. Something that suggests our ancestors were far more sophisticated than we ever imagined. And something that powerful people in the modern world seem very interested in keeping secret. Before we get into the story, quick reminder, If you're enjoying sleep theories, it would mean the world if you could leave us a 5-star review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. It genuinely helps more people find these deep dives into history's greatest mysteries. Also, drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. I love seeing our global community. Someone commented last week that they were listening from a research station in Antarctica at 3 in the morning, which is absolutely wild. Alright, let's get into it. Previous chapters 1 to 6 remain exactly as provided in the document. Chapter 7. The Hidden Blueprint. The breakthrough came in December of 2019, 3 months into the excavation of the Nineveh site. Workers clearing debris from the lowest chamber, the one containing the base of the central shaft, found a sealed alcove built into the wall. The seal was intact, undisturbed for millennia, marked with cuneiform symbols that translated roughly as, "For those who come after, should wisdom guide their hands." Inside the alcove was a basalt tablet, polished smooth and covered in intricate carvings. The preservation was remarkable. Where other clay tablets had crumbled or suffered water damage over the centuries, this stone tablet remained pristine, as if it had been sealed away just yesterday rather than 27 centuries ago. Dr. Vasquez photographed the tablet in place before removing it, documenting every detail. The cuneiform inscriptions covered both sides of the tablet, dense with text and interspersed with technical diagrams of stunning complexity. This wasn't the simple pictographic writing of early Sumerian civilization. This was advanced technical documentation, the kind of detailed schematic you might find in a modern engineering manual. The tablet was transported to a climate-controlled facility in Baghdad, where specialists in ancient Mesopotamian languages could begin the painstaking work of translation. Dr. Sarah Winters, the researcher who had identified the earlier technical tablet in the British Museum, flew in from London to assist. She brought with her detailed photographs and translations of that earlier document. Suspecting the two tablets might be related, she was right. The Nineveh tablet was a companion document, more detailed and comprehensive than the fragment in the British Museum. Where the earlier tablet had shown basic schematics, this one provided complete construction specifications, materials lists, precise measurements, step-by-step assembly instructions, and most remarkably, theoretical explanations of how and why the technology worked. The translation took weeks. The technical terminology was unlike anything in standard cuneiform dictionaries. Many concepts had no direct equivalent in modern language, requiring careful interpretation based on context and the physical evidence from the excavated chambers. But slowly, impossibly, a coherent picture emerged. The tablet described the construction of what it called a heaven-earth resonator, a device designed to capture and channel natural electromagnetic forces. The text explained that the Earth itself generates electrical potential through the interaction of its molten core with the magnetic field. Lightning demonstrates this power during storms, but the potential exists constantly, waiting to be harnessed. The vertical shaft served as an antenna, extending deep into the Earth to tap into geomagnetic currents, while simultaneously reaching toward the sky to capture atmospheric electricity. The copper coils wound around the shaft created an electromagnetic inductor, amplifying the natural currents into usable power. The crystalline arrays positioned throughout the chambers acted as piezoelectric transducers, converting mechanical vibrations from seismic activity and temperature fluctuations into additional electrical charge. But the most remarkable section of the tablet dealt with what it called water summoning. The text explained that water vapour exists invisibly in all air, even in the driest deserts. The particles of water are too small and dispersed to see, but they can be influenced by powerful forces. Just as a lodestone attracts iron, electromagnetic fields of sufficient strength can attract and concentrate water molecules. The tablet provided detailed calculations for the field strength required to induce condensation from atmospheric moisture. It described the optimal geometric arrangement of the coils to create focused zones of high electromagnetic intensity. It explained how temperature differentials enhanced the effect, causing water vapour to transition rapidly from gas to liquid state. The gardens weren't irrigated by pumped water. They were irrigated by electromagnetically induced precipitation, artificial rain created through manipulation of atmospheric moisture. The terrace structure described in classical sources would have positioned plants within the zones of maximum electromagnetic effect, places where water would literally materialize from the air in a constant gentle mist. But the tablet went further. It described additional effects of the electromagnetic fields, enhanced plant growth through stimulation of cellular processes, pest control through electromagnetic frequencies that disrupted insect nervous systems, even psychological effects on humans, with specific frequencies inducing states of calm, focus, or spiritual awe depending on the configuration. The gardens weren't just a marvel of irrigation. They were a complete environmental control system, creating an artificial microclimate through electromagnetic manipulation of natural forces. And according to the tablet, they were just one application of the technology. The same principles could be adapted for weather control, communication across vast distances, even medical treatment through electromagnetic therapy. Dr. Winters sat back from her translation work, rubbing tired eyes. "This isn't ancient superstition or religious mysticism," she said to Vasquez. "This is applied physics, sophisticated, practical, tested engineering based on deep understanding of natural forces." "Who wrote this?" Vasquez asked. "The tablet is from Sennacherib's era, but the knowledge it describes is far more advanced." Winters pointed to a passage near the beginning of the tablet. It says here, "Copied from the teachings of the Apkallu, preserved in the library of Eridu, first city of the world, built before the deluge when the gods walked among men." The Assyrians weren't inventing this technology. They were copying it from sources that were already ancient to them. Eridu was the oldest known city in Mesopotamia, occupied as early as 5000 before the Common Era. If the tablet was accurate, technical knowledge of electromagnetic engineering existed in some form over 4,000 years, before Sennacherib, over 4,500 years before the present day. That pushed the origins of the technology back into what archaeologists considered the Stone Age, a period when humans supposedly possessed only the most primitive tools. But what if that periodization was wrong? What if advanced civilization existed far earlier than conventional history acknowledged? The flood myth spoke of a lost world, a golden age destroyed by catastrophe. Archaeological sites around the world showed evidence of sophisticated knowledge that seemed out of place for their time period. Perhaps these weren't anomalies. Perhaps they were remnants of a forgotten age when humanity had achieved technological sophistication we're only now rediscovering. The tablet contained one final section that chilled everyone who read it. A warning, written in stark, unambiguous language. "Let those who seek this knowledge be warned. The power to summon water from air can also banish water from earth. The forces that bring life can bring death. The antediluvian kings wielded this power without wisdom. They turned the resonators to war, seeking to destroy their enemies by stealing rain from their lands, by sending storms to flood their cities. They created weapons that shook the earth and split the sky. And in their hubris, they destroyed themselves. The deluge that ended the First Age was no act of gods, but the consequence of forces unleashed beyond control. We who survived seal this knowledge in stone and earth, that it may serve future generations if they prove wiser than we were. But if wisdom is lacking, let it remain hidden, for the price of misuse is not merely death, but the ending of ages." Dr. Vasquez read the warning 3 times, each time feeling a deeper sense of unease. The tablet was describing a technological catastrophe, a civilization that developed powerful electromagnetic technology, weaponized it, and triggered some kind of environmental collapse that resulted in the Great Flood remembered in myth across multiple cultures. If that interpretation was correct, the implications were staggering. It meant humanity had reached high levels of technological development before, had nearly destroyed itself, had been set back to primitive conditions and spent thousands of years climbing back toward what was lost. It meant our current civilization wasn't the first, might not be unique, might be following a pattern that had played out before, and it meant the knowledge they had uncovered was genuinely dangerous, not just theoretically, but practically. historically proven to be capable of causing civilization-level catastrophe if misused. "We need to be extremely careful about how we publish this," Winters said quietly. Vasquez nodded, but she was thinking about something else. The tablet had been deliberately sealed in a hidden alcove marked with a warning about wisdom. Someone in the ancient world had tried very hard to preserve this knowledge, while also restricting access to it. They wanted future generations to be able to find it, but only if those future generations were responsible enough to use it properly. The question was whether modern civilization met that criteria, and based on what was about to happen, the answer appeared to be no. Chapter 8. Why the technology, vanished understanding. How the electromagnetic gardens worked was one thing. Understanding why they disappeared was another puzzle entirely, one that would prove far more disturbing. Dr. Vasquez and her team spent the early months of 2020 analysing the Nineveh tablet and comparing it to the physical evidence from both excavation sites. Dr. Chen, the MIT physicist, worked with engineers to create computer models of the system based on the ancient specifications. The models confirmed what the tablet claimed. The technology would work exactly as described. But the models also revealed something troubling. The electromagnetic fields generated by the system at full power would be enormous, far stronger than anything in nature except lightning strikes. And unlike lightning, which dissipates in microseconds, these fields would be sustained continuously for as long as the system operated. Chen ran simulations of the environmental effects. The immediate area around the gardens would experience dramatically altered conditions. Atmospheric humidity would spike, air ionization would increase dramatically, the local magnetic field would be distorted, and these effects wouldn't stay local. Electromagnetic fields propagate. They spread outward, diminishing with distance but still measurable hundreds of miles away. Multiple installations operating simultaneously would create interference patterns. The fields would interact, reinforcing in some locations, cancelling in others. Weather patterns would shift as atmospheric moisture was redistributed. Animal migrations would be disrupted as species dependent on magnetic field navigation lost their way. And there were concerning implications for human health, particularly long-term exposure to strong electromagnetic fields. "This isn't just garden technology," Chen explained to a meeting of the research team. "This is geoengineering, climate manipulation. If multiple sites across Mesopotamia were operating these systems, they could have altered weather patterns across the entire region, maybe beyond." Dr. Winters had been researching historical climate data for ancient Mesopotamia. She found something remarkable. Around 600 before the Common Era, roughly the time period when Nebuchadnezzar's gardens would have been operational, there was a significant wet period in the archaeological record. Increased flooding, higher water tables, more extensive agriculture. Then, abruptly around 500 before the Common Era, the climate shifted. Drought, decreased rainfall, environmental stress. What if the climate improvement wasn't natural, Winters suggested? What if it was artificially created by the electromagnetic installations? And when those installations were shut down, the climate reverted to its normal arid state. The implications were staggering. If true, it meant ancient Mesopotamian civilization had become dependent on artificial climate control. When that technology was lost or deliberately shut down, the environmental consequences would have been severe. Crop failures, water shortages, the kind of environmental stress that could trigger the collapse of civilizations. But why would the technology be deliberately shut down? The tablet provided part of the answer with its warnings about weapons and catastrophe. But Vasquez suspected there was more to the story, information that hadn't made it into the surviving records. She found the clue in a seemingly unrelated source, a fragment of a Greek text written by Ctesias, a Greek physician who worked at the Persian court in the 5th century before the Common Era. Ctesias wrote about Babylon during the Persian period, after its conquest by Cyrus. Most of his work was lost, surviving only in quotations by later authors, but one passage had always puzzled historians. "The gardens of Babylon stood abandoned in my time, the waters no longer flowing, the trees withered and dead. The Persian Magi examined the foundations and declared the place cursed, the devices below ground to be sealed forever by order of the King of Kings. They said the ancient builders had offended the gods by presuming to control forces meant for heaven alone. Conventional interpretation assumed this was religious prohibition, Persian priests objecting to Babylonian technology on spiritual grounds. But read in light of the electromagnetic installations, it took on new meaning. The Persian Magi were priests, yes, but they were also the inheritors of ancient Mesopotamian knowledge traditions. They would have understood what the underground devices actually were and what they could do, and they ordered them sealed, not destroyed, but sealed, deliberately buried and forbidden. Dr. Vasquez found more evidence in cuneiform texts from the Persian period. Administrative documents from Babylon contained references to large quantities of stone and earth being moved to the palace district, construction projects that seemed to be filling in excavations rather than creating new buildings, orders from Persian authorities to prevent anyone from digging in certain areas. The Persians were systematically burying the electromagnetic installations, cutting them off from atmospheric contact, filling in the vertical shafts, sealing the chambers, and they were doing it deliberately as official policy. They knew what they had found, Vasquez realized. They knew it was dangerous, and they decided it needed to stay buried. But the Persians hadn't worked alone. Further research revealed similar patterns at other sites. Nineveh had been partially destroyed by the Medes and Babylonians in 612 before the Common Era. But after the conquest, there was an unusual construction period. Not rebuilding the city, but filling in underground chambers, sealing tunnels. The conquerors weren't just destroying Nineveh. They were making sure whatever was beneath it stayed beneath it. A pattern emerged every time one of these electromagnetic installations was discovered by later civilizations. It was deliberately sealed again. Not merely left to decay, but actively buried. Someone, across multiple cultures and time periods, was working to keep this technology hidden. Dr. Chen suggested a disturbing possibility. What if there's an organization, a tradition spanning thousands of years, specifically dedicated to suppressing this knowledge? Secret societies are usually dismissed as conspiracy theory, but ancient priesthoods genuinely did preserve secret knowledge. What if some of them had the specific mission of preventing electromagnetic technology from being rediscovered? It sounded paranoid, but the evidence supported it. The Persian Magi sealing the Babylon site, the priesthoods of various Mesopotamian temples that had access to ancient texts but never revealed their contents, the mystery schools of ancient Greece and Egypt that claimed to preserve secret wisdom from antediluvian times, and if such a tradition existed in the ancient world, was it possible it survived into the modern era? That there were still people, still organizations, who knew about ancient electromagnetic technology and worked to keep it suppressed? The team was about to find out the answer was yes, and those people were about to take a very direct interest in the excavations at Babylon and Nineveh. Chapter 9. Suppressed publication. Dr. Vasquez prepared her findings for publication in the spring of 2020. The paper was comprehensive, meticulously documented, and utterly revolutionary. It detailed the electromagnetic installations found beneath Babylon and Nineveh, included translations of the technical tablets, presented evidence that ancient Mesopotamian civilization possessed advanced knowledge of physics and engineering, and argued for a complete reassessment of human technological development. She submitted it to 3 of the most prestigious peer-reviewed archaeology journals, the Journal of Archaeological Science, Antiquity, and the American Journal of Archaeology. All 3 journals had published her work before. She had a solid reputation, decades of professional publications, and impeccable credentials. The paper should have at least gone to external review, even if editors were skeptical of the conclusions. Instead, all 3 journals rejected it without review. The rejection letters were nearly identical, professionally polite but firm. The findings were too anomalous, too far outside conventional historical understanding. The interpretation of the copper-lined chambers as electromagnetic devices was unsupported speculation. The translations of the tablets were questioned despite being performed by recognized experts in cuneiform languages. The paper represented fringe archaeology, not serious scholarship. Vasquez was shocked, but not entirely surprised. Revolutionary findings always faced resistance. She revised the paper, focused more on the physical evidence and less on theoretical interpretation, and resubmitted. This time she included detailed reports from Dr. Chen and other physicists, confirming that the discovered structures were consistent with electromagnetic systems. The second round of rejections came faster. No explanation, just form letters declining publication. Then her funding situation changed. The grant supporting her research in Iraq was scheduled for renewal in June of 2020. The renewal should have been automatic. Her work was rated as highly productive by the review committees. She was producing significant archaeological discoveries. There was no reasonable justification for denying renewal. The renewal was denied. No explanation given beyond vague references to shifting research priorities and budgetary constraints. Appeals were rejected. Without funding, Vasquez couldn't maintain her team in Iraq. The excavations had to be suspended. The Iraqi Department of Antiquities, which had been cooperative if cautious up to this point, suddenly revoked her excavation permits entirely. The stated reason was that the sites needed to be secured and protected pending further study by Iraqi authorities. Iraqi authorities who immediately restricted all access to the Babylon and Nineveh sites. Workers were brought in to fill in the excavated chambers, not to protect them, but to rebury them. Within weeks, the underground installations that had been exposed to light for the first time in millennia were sealed again beneath tons of earth. Vasquez tried to protest, tried to contact colleagues in Iraq, tried to appeal through academic channels. She found herself facing a wall of silence. Former collaborators stopped returning calls. University administrators who had supported her work suddenly became unavailable. Her emails went unanswered. Then the government interest began. In July of 2020, Vasquez received a visit at her home in California from two men in dark suits who identified themselves as representatives from the Department of Defense, specifically from an agency called the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, or DARPA. They were polite, professional, and very interested in her research. They asked detailed questions about the electromagnetic installations. They wanted to know about the coil configurations, the crystalline arrays, the power generation systems. They were particularly interested in the atmospheric water generation effects. Could the technology be scaled up? Could it be made portable? What were the military applications? Vasquez refused to speculate on military applications. She emphasized that her work was purely archaeological, focused on understanding ancient civilizations, not on developing new weapons. The men nodded politely and left. But the message was clear. The United States military was very interested in what she had found. Over the following months, Vasquez received similar visits from representatives of other nations, a team from China, ostensibly from a university, but asking questions that suggested military intelligence background. Scientists representing Russian archaeological institutes who were far more interested in technical specifications than in historical context. Even representatives from private corporations, technology companies and defense contractors offering substantial sums for consulting work. Everyone wanted access to the ancient electromagnetic technology, and everyone was being told no by someone with more power than Vasquez possessed. The artifacts from the excavation, including the precious basalt tablet with its technical diagrams, were moved to a secure facility in Baghdad. Vasquez was told they were being preserved for future study. When she requested access to continue analysis, she was denied. The artifacts were classified as Iraqi national treasures, access restricted to authorized personnel only. Vasquez's Iraqi contacts told her the truth off the record. The artifacts weren't in Baghdad at all. They had been crated and shipped out of Iraq entirely. Where they went, no one would say, but the smart money was on the United States. Specifically, to a military research facility where they could be studied without public scrutiny. The basalt tablet, the ancient instruction manual for building electromagnetic installations, had disappeared into classified research programs. The technology the ancient world had tried so hard to seal away was now in the hands of modern military and intelligence agencies. and they weren't planning to publish their findings in academic journals. But Vasquez had been careful. She had made copies of everything. Photographs of the artifacts, scans of the tablets, detailed documentation of the excavations. She had shared this data with trusted colleagues around the world, insurance against exactly this kind of suppression. She couldn't publish through traditional academic channels, but in the age of the internet there were alternatives. She prepared a comprehensive report, included all her documentation, and uploaded it to independent research platforms, preprint servers, and alternative media sites. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within days, the report had been viewed tens of thousands of times. Researchers around the world downloaded the data and began their own analysis. The findings couldn't be suppressed completely because they were already out in the open. But something else happened. A coordinated campaign to discredit the research. Articles appeared in mainstream media describing Vasquez as a crackpot, a fringe archaeologist making wild claims about ancient aliens and lost civilizations. Never mind that she had never mentioned aliens. Never mind that her research was based on physical evidence and legitimate scholarship. The narrative was being controlled. Someone with substantial resources and media influence was working to ensure that if the research couldn't be suppressed, it could at least be discredited. Pushed to the fringes where serious scholars wouldn't engage with it, where the public would dismiss it as conspiracy theory, rather than legitimate archaeology. And it was working. Despite the evidence, despite the documentation, despite the testimony of multiple credentialed experts, the mainstream academic and scientific establishment closed ranks. The Babylon discoveries were deemed too extraordinary to be believed. The electromagnetic interpretation was rejected as fantasy, and anyone who took the research seriously risked their own professional reputation. Dr. Chen, the MIT physicist, found himself facing career consequences for supporting Vasquez's interpretations. Funding for his research was questioned. His department chair suggested he distance himself from the Babylon project if he wanted to maintain his position. The message was clear. This was a career-ending line of inquiry, but not everyone backed. Down. Researchers around the world began re-examining ancient sites with new eyes, looking for evidence of similar electromagnetic installations, and they were finding it. Underground chambers beneath temples in Egypt, unexplained metallic structures at sites in South America, geometric patterns that looked suspiciously like antenna arrays carved into stone monuments worldwide. The evidence was accumulating. Ancient civilizations really had possessed sophisticated technology. The electromagnetic installations weren't unique to Mesopotamia. They were global, and someone across multiple cultures and time periods had worked systematically to hide them. The question was whether modern civilization would prove wiser than the ancients, whether we would use this rediscovered knowledge responsibly, or whether we would repeat the mistakes that led to catastrophe before. Based on what was happening behind classified doors in research facilities around the world, the answer wasn't encouraging. Chapter 10. The Modern Replication Attempt. While Dr. Vasquez fought to get her research acknowledged by mainstream academia, someone else was taking a more direct approach. A private research facility in Nevada, funded by a group of anonymous investors interested in alternative energy technology, had obtained copies of her documentation, and they decided to test whether the ancient system could actually function as described. The facility was located in a remote area north of Las Vegas, far from prying eyes and curious neighbours. The team they assembled included electrical engineers, materials scientists, and theoretical physicists. None of them cared about academic politics or career risks. They wanted to know if the technology worked. They started small, a scaled-down version of the Babylon system, built according to the specifications in the ancient tablets. A vertical shaft only 15 feet deep rather than over 100. Copper coils wound with precise spacing, a lower chamber filled with electrolytic solution matching the chemical composition found in the Babylon excavation. Crystalline arrays positioned according to the geometric patterns described in the documentation. The total cost was substantial, well over $1 million in materials and construction. But the investors had deep pockets and were willing to fund the experiment. By September of 2020, the apparatus was complete and ready for testing. Initially, nothing happened. The system sat inert, just elaborate metalwork and coloured liquid. The engineers tried various configurations, different alignments, adjustments to the coil spacing. Weeks passed without results. The project seemed destined to prove that the ancient technology was purely symbolic, that any resemblance to functional electromagnetic systems was coincidental. Then a research assistant named Jennifer Park noticed something unusual. During thunderstorms, electromagnetic field detectors around the apparatus showed increased activity. Not just random noise from the lightning, but structured patterns that seemed to synchronize with the storm's electrical discharges. The copper coils were responding to the atmospheric electricity, acting as antennas picking up electromagnetic radiation from the lightning. On impulse, Park suggested installing a lightning rod directly connected to the central shaft. If the system was designed to capture atmospheric electricity, it needed a direct pathway for that energy to enter. The next major thunderstorm wasn't scheduled for weeks, but Las Vegas occasionally experienced isolated electrical storms in the fall. They would wait and see what happened. The storm arrived on October the 7th, 2020. As lightning flashed across the desert sky, the research team monitored their equipment. Multiple cameras recorded from different angles. Electromagnetic sensors logged field strength. Temperature and humidity monitors tracked environmental conditions. When lightning struck the rod, everything changed. The electromagnetic field around the apparatus spiked dramatically, not just from the lightning itself, which dissipated in milliseconds, but sustained. The copper coils were storing and amplifying the charge exactly as the ancient design intended. The fields weren't uniform. They pulsed in specific patterns, strongest around the coiled sections, creating zones of intense electromagnetic activity. Temperature sensors in those zones registered a sudden drop, several degrees in seconds, far too rapid to be explained by ambient weather changes. And humidity readings spiked. Water was condensing out of the air, pulled from vapor state into liquid droplets by the electromagnetic forces. Within an hour, visible condensation was forming on surfaces near the coils. Not just normal humidity, but steady streams of water appearing seemingly from nowhere. Flowing down the copper surfaces like miniature waterfalls, the system was generating water from atmospheric moisture, exactly as the ancient text described. The team placed plants near the apparatus, fast-growing species that would show results quickly. Within days, the effects were obvious. Plants positioned in the zones of high electromagnetic activity showed dramatically accelerated growth. Leaves were larger, greener, more vigorous. Root development was enhanced. The plants were thriving. Dr. Chen flew out to Nevada to observe the functioning system. He brought sophisticated measurement equipment, instruments that could precisely quantify the electromagnetic fields and their effects. The readings confirmed what the visual evidence showed. The ancient technology worked exactly as advertised. This is atmospheric water generation on a scale I didn't think was possible without enormous power inputs, Chen said, studying his instruments. The electromagnetic fields are manipulating water molecules at the quantum level, affecting their phase transitions. It's elegant, efficient, and completely revolutionary for our understanding of what ancient peoples could achieve. But there were troubling aspects to the results. The electromagnetic fields extended far beyond the immediate area of the apparatus. At reduced strength, they were measurable over 100 meters away, and they weren't static. They pulsed, cycled through frequency variations, created interference patterns that spread in expanding waves. Local wildlife began behaving strangely. Birds avoided flying over the facility. Insects, normally abundant in the desert, were absent from the area. Small mammals showed signs of stress when brought near the operating system. The electromagnetic fields were affecting animal nervous systems, disrupting normal behaviours in ways that could be dangerous if scaled up. And there were effects on humans too. Several members of the research team reported headaches when working near the active system. Sleep disturbances, difficulty concentrating. Nothing severe, but noticeable. Electromagnetic hypersensitivity was controversial in mainstream medicine, but the team was experiencing something. The team decided to test the system at higher power. They enhanced the lightning rod system, added capacitor banks to store larger charges, and modified the coils to handle increased current. During the next major storm, they let the system operate at what they estimated was 30% of the capacity the full Babylon installation would have possessed. The results were dramatic and unsettling. Water generation increased exponentially, gallons per hour pouring from the atmospheric condensation. The electromagnetic fields became so strong that electronic equipment within 50 meters began malfunctioning. Radio communication was disrupted, the local power grid experienced fluctuations, and the weather changed. Humidity in the area spiked to levels far above normal for the Nevada desert. A local fog developed, thick and unnatural. Within the zone of influence, the temperature dropped 10 degrees. Clouds formed directly above the facility despite clear skies everywhere else. They were creating weather, artificial, localized, but unmistakably weather manipulation. The ancient Mesopotamians hadn't just built irrigation systems, they had built climate control devices. The team shut down the system immediately. The implications were too serious to continue without careful consideration. If this technology could alter weather at 30% power, what could the full-scale Babylon installation have done? And what would happen if multiple sites operated simultaneously? Climate manipulation, weather weapons, the ability to cause drought or flood, to steal rain from enemies, to create agricultural abundance in one region while causing famine in another. The ancient warnings about antediluvian weapons suddenly seemed very real and very relevant. The Nevada facility prepared a detailed report of their findings. Before they could decide how to publish it, they received a visit from federal agents, Department of Energy officials accompanied by military representatives. The visitors were polite but firm. The research had national security implications. The apparatus and all documentation needed to be secured under government oversight. The team was given a choice: continue their research under classified conditions with government funding, or cease all work and turn over their findings. Either way, public disclosure was not an option. This technology was too potentially dangerous to be available to just anyone. Most of the team chose to continue under government oversight. The work was too fascinating to abandon. But Jennifer Park, the research assistant who had figured out the lightning rod solution, quit. She copied as much data as she could on her way out the door. She sent that data to Dr. Vasquez, and Vasquez added it to the growing collection of evidence that ancient electromagnetic technology was not only real, but functional. It worked, and modern military and intelligence agencies around the world were racing to develop it as a new generation of weapons and control systems. The technology that had destroyed an ancient civilization was being rebuilt, and despite the warnings carved in tablets 3,000 years ago, modern humanity seemed determined to repeat the mistakes of the past. Epilogue. The civilization. Before civilization. Stand in the ruins of Babylon today and you see only sand and broken stone. Nothing suggests the impossible gardens that once defied nature itself. The Iraqi government has filled in the excavations, buried the copper-lined chambers, sealed the ancient technology back in the earth where it remained hidden for millennia. Official statements claim the sites need protection from looters and environmental damage. The real reason is more complicated and more disturbing, but you can't bury the truth completely, not anymore. The digital age makes information nearly impossible to suppress. Dr. Vasquez's research exists on servers around the world, downloaded thousands of times, discussed in forums and alternative research communities. The Nineveh tablet translations are available online. Photographs of the electromagnetic installations circulate through academic backchannels, shared by researchers who know they can't publish openly, but refuse to pretend they didn't see what they saw. And once you know what to look for, the evidence is everywhere. Ancient sites around the world show signs of electromagnetic technology. Underground chambers lined with conductive materials, crystalline structures positioned in geometric patterns, vertical shafts descending into bedrock for no apparent architectural reason, features that conventional archaeology dismisses as mysterious, but which make perfect sense if you understand what they actually are. The Great Pyramid of Giza with its granite chambers and precise alignments, the Temple of Karnak with its forest of columns creating a massive resonance chamber, Göbekli Tepe in Turkey with its T-shaped pillars and underground installations dated to 10,000 before the Common Era, Pumapunku in Bolivia with its precisely carved stones and megalithic construction. These aren't just religious monuments, they're the remnants of a global technological civilization that existed before recorded history began. Mainstream academia refuses to acknowledge this. The implications are too revolutionary, too threatening to established models of human development. If advanced civilization existed 10,000 years ago or earlier, if it developed sophisticated technology and then collapsed, it means everything we thought we knew about the arc of human progress is wrong. It means technological advancement isn't inevitable or linear. It means civilizations can rise to great heights and fall to oblivion, losing everything they built. It means our modern world is fragile in ways we don't like to admit. And it means the ancient warnings about misusing powerful technology are not myths or superstition, but historical records of actual catastrophe. The flood myths remember what happened. A worldwide disaster that destroyed an advanced civilization. Not divine punishment, but technological catastrophe. Climate manipulation pushed too far. Weather weapons used in war without understanding the consequences. Electromagnetic installations operating at such power and scale that they destabilized atmospheric and geological systems, triggering the collapse that sent humanity back to primitive conditions. The survivors, the legendary Apkallu and their equivalents in other cultures, preserved what knowledge they could. They encoded it in myths and religious traditions. They built monuments aligned with astronomical precision to preserve mathematical and engineering knowledge in stone. They created secret societies and priesthoods to guard the most dangerous technologies, ensuring they would remain hidden until humanity was wise enough to use them responsibly. But they failed. The knowledge is being rediscovered, and we are not proving to be wiser than our ancestors. In research facilities around the world, scientists are rebuilding ancient electromagnetic systems. They're studying atmospheric water generation for commercial applications. They're developing weather manipulation technology for agricultural use. They're exploring electromagnetic frequency weapons that can affect human neurological function from a distance. All applications of the same fundamental technology that destroyed a civilization 10,000 years ago. The warning signs are already visible. Climate instability increasing worldwide, weather patterns becoming more extreme and unpredictable. Some of it is certainly due to conventional industrial activity and greenhouse gas emissions, but how much might be due to classified electromagnetic experimentation? How many government research programs are testing technologies they don't fully understand, pushing boundaries without considering the systemic consequences? We'll probably never know. That information is classified at the highest levels, restricted to people with security clearances far beyond what elected officials possess. Secret programs operating with black budgets, developing technologies the public has no knowledge of, making decisions that affect all of humanity without any democratic oversight or public debate. The ancient Mesopotamian engineers who built the Hanging Gardens tried to control nature. For a time, they succeeded. They created impossible gardens in the desert. They demonstrated that human ingenuity could overcome natural limitations, and then everything collapsed, destroyed by the consequences of technologies they thought they understood but didn't. We're following the same path. We've rediscovered their knowledge. Instead of heeding their warnings, we're racing to implement it, faster than our competitors. Every nation wants the strategic advantage of weather control, of electromagnetic weapons, of technologies that can reshape the environment to human will. No one wants to be left behind while rivals develop capabilities they don't possess. It's an arms race. Just like the antediluvian kings competed with their electromagnetic installations, modern nations compete with classified research programs, and arms races have a long history of ending badly, of creating weapons that ultimately get used, of unleashing consequences that no one intended or predicted. Dr. Elena Vasquez continues her research from her home in California. She's been effectively blacklisted from mainstream archaeology, but she's become a prominent figure in alternative research communities. She gives lectures at independent conferences, publishes on platforms that don't require peer review, and continues to sound the alarm about what she discovered beneath Babylon. The Hanging Gardens weren't destroyed by time or conquest, she says in one of her presentations. They were deliberately dismantled by people who understood they were too dangerous to keep operational. The ancient world made a conscious decision to seal this technology away, and we've made a conscious decision to dig it back up and develop it. I think history will show our decision was a mistake. I just hope we figure that out before we repeat the catastrophe that ended the last technological age. Her warnings are dismissed by mainstream scientists who haven't examined the evidence, who assume ancient peoples couldn't have possessed such knowledge, who trust that modern civilization is fundamentally different from and more advanced than anything that came before. But some researchers listen. Some understand that the archaeological evidence is real, that the technology works, that the warnings carved in ancient tablets are not myths, but urgent messages from people who learned terrible lessons about the consequences of hubris. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon are more than a lost wonder. They're a message from our ancestors, a warning that technological power without wisdom leads to disaster, a reminder that civilizations can rise to great heights and fall to nothing, losing everything except fragmented memories preserved in myth. A demonstration that the cycle has happened before and can happen again. We assume we're smarter than ancient peoples, more sophisticated, more advanced. We trust that our science is better, our understanding deeper, our ability to control nature more developed. But the copper-lined chambers beneath Babylon tell a different story. They tell us that people 3,000 years ago, or perhaps 10,000 years ago, or perhaps even earlier, developed technologies we're only now beginning to understand. And they chose to hide those technologies because they had learned, through bitter experience, what happens when such power is misused. The gardens that shouldn't have worked did work. They rose above the desert, green and impossible, sustained by forces that ancient writers could barely describe. They were monuments to human ingenuity, proof that we could master nature itself. And then they vanished, sealed deliberately beneath the earth, hidden so completely that for thousands of years we forgot they existed. Now we've found them again. We've decoded the tablets, analysed the structures, rebuilt the systems. We've confirmed that the ancient technology is real and functional, and we're developing it for modern use, convinced we can control forces that destroyed an earlier civilization. Perhaps we're right. Perhaps modern science and democratic oversight will prevent the catastrophic misuse that ancient warnings describe. Perhaps we really are wiser than our ancestors. But looking at the classified research programs, the military applications, the competition between nations to develop these technologies first, the pattern looks disturbingly familiar. Power without wisdom, capability without responsibility, the rush to implement technologies we don't fully understand because we're afraid of falling behind those who might implement them first. The Hanging Gardens stand as a warning, not just of what we can achieve, but of what we can lose, not just of the heights we can reach, but of how far we can fall. The antediluvian civilization rose to technological sophistication, perhaps even surpassing our own in certain areas, and then it fell, destroyed by the consequences of its own power, leaving behind only ruins and myths and warnings that later generations would dismiss as impossible fantasies. We're not the first technological age, we're just the latest. The question is whether we'll be the last, or whether some future civilization will dig up our ruins and wonder how we vanished, why our great cities fell silent, what catastrophe ended our era just as catastrophe ended the era of those who came before. The answers are waiting in the earth, carved in ancient tablets, preserved in myths and legends that we treat as entertaining stories rather than historical warnings. The Hanging Gardens that shouldn't have worked reveal that our understanding of human history is incomplete, that ancient civilizations achieved far more than we credit them with, and that the technological confidence of our modern age may be as misguided as the confidence of those who built impossible gardens in the desert and believed they had mastered nature itself. The cycle continues, rise and fall, achievement and catastrophe, technological sophistication followed by collapse, unless we learn from the warnings left by those who came before. unless we recognise that the Hanging Gardens are not just an archaeological mystery, but a message from the past, telling us that the path we're walking has been walked before, and it leads to a place we don't want to go. The choice is ours. The technology exists. The knowledge is available. The electromagnetic systems that could reshape our world for better or worse are being developed right now in classified facilities around the globe. What happens next depends on whether we prove wiser than the antediluvian kings, whether we can resist the temptation to weaponize everything we discover, whether we can learn to use power responsibly instead of competitively. The ancient world tried and failed. They left us warnings, hoping future generations would learn from their mistakes. Now we face the same test, and the evidence suggests we're failing it in exactly the same ways they did. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon were real. They worked through technology we're only beginning to understand. They were deliberately hidden because they were too dangerous. And now they're being rebuilt by people who think they know better, who believe modern science has surpassed ancient wisdom, who are convinced that this time will be different. History suggests otherwise. The ruins of vanished civilizations suggest otherwise. The warnings carved in stone 3,000 years ago suggest otherwise. The gardens rise again, not in Babylon, but in research facilities in Nevada and elsewhere around the world. The copper coils wind deep into the earth. The electromagnetic fields pulse and grow stronger. Water condenses from empty air, and somewhere, ancient engineers who understood what happens when this power is unleashed without wisdom would be warning us to stop, to seal the installations, to hide the knowledge before it's too late. But we're not listening. We never do. Every civilization believes it's different, smarter, more advanced. Every age thinks it has surpassed what came before, and every empire thinks its fall is impossible, right up until the moment it collapses into dust and is forgotten, leaving behind only ruins for future archaeologists to puzzle over. The Hanging Gardens are not a mystery. They're a warning, and we're ignoring it.